It is the evening of the 3rd of July 1187. West of the Sea of Galilee in the Holy Land, the encamped Crusader forces hear the ominous sound of Muslim war drums nearby. The Crusader leader, the King of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, knows what the enemy, who heavily outnumber his men, are doing. They intend to intimidate the Crusaders throughout the night before battle the next day. As dawn rises over the horns of Hattin, an extinct volcano, Guy and his men break camp. Then the Muslim horde strikes. The Christians attempt to break out from the encirclement, but in the hours of fighting that follow, they are comprehensively defeated. Guy is taken alive and is now the captive of the Muslim leader who, with victory at the Battle of Hattin, has the conquest of Jerusalem, after nearly a century in Christian hands, within his reach. His name, Saladin, the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt. The man known to history as Saladin, or Salah ad-Din, meaning righteousness of the faith, was born in 1137 AD in Tikrit, situated on the right bank of the Tigris, between Mosul and Baghdad, in modern-day Iraq. Saladin's father was Najm ad-Din Ayyub, the governor of Tikrit at that time, who was an honourable, honest and good man, whose family were closely related to the Shaddadids dynasty, who ruled parts of Armenia between the 10th and 12th centuries. Saladin was given the birth name Yusuf, and his family ancestry can be traced back to the Kurdish areas of modern Iraq and Armenia. On the very night of Saladin's birth, his father evacuated the family from Tikrit, due to the fact that his father had harboured Zengid soldiers, which angered the regional administration. They eventually settled in Damascus, the capital of modern-day Syria, and one of the world's oldest cities. When he was young, Saladin was said to have shown the qualities needed to lead from an early age, and his education was, by all accounts, varied, and included disciplines such as alchemy and arithmetic, as well as religion, and of course the Quran. Saladin was also fluent in Kurdish and Arabic. He at first showed greater interest in learning religion rather than strategy and tactics, but he was placed under the tutelage of his uncle Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, who was an important military commander within Damascus. During the First Crusade in the final years of the 11th century, European Christians had established various kingdoms in the Holy Land, most notably the Principality of Antioch and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And because of this, there was a pressing necessity for the Islamic world in the Middle East to become more capable militarily, and so the rudiments of military command which Saladin was gaining during this time would stand him in good stead over the coming years and decades. Since its founding in the 6th century, Islam had spread rapidly through various caliphates, which were, in essence, areas of the Muslim world which swore allegiance to religious leaders or caliphs. These leaders were either chosen in the case of Sunni Muslims or were descended, in the case of Shia Muslims, from the Prophet Muhammad himself. Muslim rulers would reign over their respective territories, but still hold allegiance to their caliphs, either Sunni or Shia. A good comparison would be how medieval France or England were states in their own right, but still swore allegiance to the papacy. Indeed, to understand the balance of power in the Middle East at the time, it is necessary to keep in mind the power struggle between Sunni and Shia caliphates, as well as the various Muslim states or empire and the Crusader states. The First Crusade had been called in response to the increasing encroachment of the Seljuk Empire on the territories held by the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia, and by the time of Saladin's birth, the Seljuk Empire, which was largely of Turkish origin, ruled over much of the Middle East, while the Fatimid dynasty ruled over Egypt and eastern North Africa. Saladin was of Turkish origin and lived his early life within the borders of an area of modern-day northern Iraq, which was ruled by the Zengid dynasty, but overall control of this area was still in the hands of the Seljuk Empire, as Zengid Syria was a vassal of the Seljuk Empire, and the ruler of Syria at the time was Emir Nur ad-Din. The majority of the events of Saladin's life and destiny would, however, take place further south of his birthplace, in modern-day Iraq, within Egypt and the Holy Land, where he would found a new dynasty in his own name and change the course of history in the Middle East and beyond. In 1163, the vizier, or political ruler under the Egyptian Fatimid Caliph al-Adid, a man named Shawah, was driven out of Egypt by a rival named Dirgham after a power struggle broke out between them. Shawah then asked the ruler of Syria, Nur ad-Din, to aid him in regaining power. He agreed in return for an alliance against the Crusaders, and sent his general Shirkuh along with the 26-year-old Saladin to intervene in Egypt. The expedition was successful and Shawah was reinstated as vizier, but Shirkuh refused to withdraw his forces from the region, even after the Syrian general had been offered 30,000 dinars for the service of his army by the vizier. Subsequently, Syria's leader Nur ad-Din exploited the Fatimid weakness in Egypt to his advantage and took de facto control of the country, effectively making Shirkuh ruler in Egypt, and so allowing Zengid annexation of the territory. Another source of tension arose because the Fatimids in Egypt were Shia Muslims, who believed that their rulers should be chosen from the direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. However, the Zengids in Syria were Sunni Muslims, including Saladin, who believed Muhammad's successors should be chosen from the community of his followers. Shawah felt betrayed by Shirkuh and the Syrian Sunni forces remaining in his country, and so appealed to the Christian king in Jerusalem, Amalric I, to intervene. This resulted in Shawah and Amalric joining forces and besieging Shirkuh in the city of Bilbais. However, Shirkuh and Saladin's leader in Syria, Nur ad-Din, in turn, moved his own forces against the Crusader state of Antioch and captured the Count of Tripoli, Raymond III, in the Battle of Hattin in 1164. Before this, Saladin had only played a minor military role in the siege of Bilbais, although he was soon to ascend to legendary status in the service of Nur ad-Din. Tripoli was a Crusader state, but was also the vassal of Jerusalem at the time, which meant that Amalric and his forces had to race north to aid Raymond, and to secure their northern borders against Syria. Shirkuh also evacuated his forces north into Syria to aid his master, which meant that the Fatimid dynasty and Shawah remained in power for the time being. However, in 1166, Shirkuh and Saladin returned once again in order to regain control of Egypt, prompting Shawah to call on King Amalric for aid in fighting them. And because Amalric's naval forces had control of the eastern Mediterranean, he had the initial advantage, and so he was able to arrive in Cairo and join forces with Shawah and the Fatimids before Shirkuh and Saladin could reach the area over land. This resulted in the Battle of al-Babain, in which Saladin commanded the right wing of the Zengid Syrian forces. The confrontation proved to be bloody and inconclusive in its outcome, and eventually the Syrians tried to escape Egypt by the port of Alexandria, but were blocked by Amalric's fleet, and so Shirkuh and Saladin then agreed a truce and left Egypt, on condition that King Amalric did the same. This suited Shawa and the Fatimids, as they remained in power, and it also suited Amalric, as he retained a weak but friendly neighbour on his southern border, in the shape of Egypt. But Amalric then made a mistake that would eventually prove fatal to his ambitions of eventually controlling Egypt and to the success of the Crusades as a whole, as instead of continuing to support Fatimid Egypt, he instead chose to invade it whilst it was weak, and did so in 1168, taking the city of Bilbais and massacring its inhabitants. Shawa changed sides again in desperation and appealed to Nur ad-Din in Syria for aid, leading him to once again dispatch his great general Shirkuh to Egypt. And being faced with an enemy both in front of him and behind him, Amalric was forced to withdraw to Jerusalem. Shirkuh then marched into Cairo unopposed, and the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid ordered that his untrustworthy subordinate Shawa be brought before him, and he demanded his execution. Shirkuh then replaced him as vizier, and Zengids' Syrian de facto rule over Egypt began. In 1169, Shirkuh died after feasting on a particularly large and rich meal, probably of a heart attack, and Saladin was chosen to replace him as the country's political ruler, despite him being a Sunni and the Fatimids being Shia. A great deal of historical debate has surrounded the decision to appoint Saladin as vizier of Egypt, with some historians claiming that the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid only selected Saladin in the misplaced belief that he was a naive and complacent politician who could be easily influenced. Saladin, now instated as the new vizier, was in a very tricky position, as not only was he a Sunni in a Shia-controlled land, but he was also effectively a foreign occupier, and now had split loyalties between his master in Cairo, Caliph al-Adid, and his other master in Syria, Nur ad-Din, and there was great suspicion and resistance to his rule from all sides. However, Saladin proved himself to be an extremely efficient ruler of Egypt, and started a reform of its governance, as well as foiling an assassination attempt on his life by a group of soldiers and emirs, which was uncovered by his chief intelligence officer, and so he had the civilian controller of the Fatimid palace, Najimutamin al-Khilafa, the chief conspirator, arrested and killed. Indeed, he was also able to further his status as an effective military leader by crushing an uprising of 50,000 black African soldiers and their co-conspirators within the Fatimid regime, who opposed Saladin's new Sunni practices in office. And so, with this successful defense against insurrection, Saladin began strengthening his power base in Egypt. He placed his own family members in high-ranking positions within the region and sought to impose change on the Fatimid dynasty itself. He encouraged the spread of Sunni Islam, as well as gradually gaining and retaining greater control over the affairs of state through his rule in Egypt. He achieved this, in part, through the establishment of Sunni legal jurisprudence in Cairo and other areas of Egypt, founding a college for the Maliki branch of Sunni Islam, as well as a Shafi'i college, dedicated to the practice and interpretation of his own denomination of Sunni law. His undoubted ability as a ruler both strengthened his own position and that of Egypt as a whole, and also meant that the Crusader states were now surrounded by hostile Muslim powers, and so Saladin then increased his reputation and power even further by defeating a large Crusader Byzantine naval force at the siege of Damietta in 1169, in which his forces, with the help of reinforcements from Nur ad-Din, successfully prevented their Christian enemies from invading Egypt. Amalric had realized that the unification of the formerly opposing forces of Syria and Egypt would potentially mean doom for the Crusader states, and along with the Byzantines, assembled a massive naval force to invade Egypt. However, Amalric's army was largely prevented from landing, and with the help of reinforcements, fireships, and the weather, Saladin defeated the invasion force. With his power based in Egypt more secure than ever, Saladin now went on the offensive and attacked the heart of Crusader power in the Levant, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, his forces besieging Darum, now Deir al-Balah, in modern-day Palestine, in 1170. When King Amalric's forces came to the aid of the town, Saladin evaded them and attacked and sacked part of the city of Gaza instead, maintaining military pressure on the Christian kingdom without ever allowing his army to be engaged in a fully fledged land battle. Then, in the summer of 1171, the last Fatimid Shia Caliph, al-Adid, fell ill, and shortly afterwards died of natural causes. Saladin quickly saw his opportunity and seized power, realigning Egypt under the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad, thus ending the control exercised by the Shia Fatimid dynasty over Egypt. And so the Fatimid dynasty ended, making way for the Ayyubids, a dynasty named after Saladin's father, Ayyub. Later the same year, on the 25th of September 1171, Saladin embarked on a new conquest against the Crusaders, joining once again with his old commander Nur ad-Din, who attacked from his northern bases in Syria, allowing Saladin to move in from the southwest. They both wished to target Crusader castles, and hence planned to attack fortifications built by the Crusaders at Kerak and Montreal, the former falling to Zengid forces within a matter of days. Before attacking the castle at Montreal, Saladin had to return to Egypt after hearing of reports that Crusaders were attempting a domestic insurrection against him in his own court, and therefore Nur ad-Din had to attack his last position alone. Following this, in the summer of 1173, Saladin's territory in Egypt was attacked from the south by a Nubian army, an ethnic group hailing from what is now northern Sudan, who assembled alongside Armenians in preparation for a siege against the city of Aswan in southern Egypt. The emir of the city requested the aid of Saladin when he learned of the impending attack and was given additional troops for the defense, under the command of Saladin's brother Turan Shah. The Nubians retreated after they learned of this reinforced army, returning once more later in the year, but were ultimately forced to retreat once again. Saladin soon grew tired of the Nubians and went on the offensive, advancing south to the Nubian city of Ibrim and capturing it in a show of force for the new administration in Egypt. After his victory against the Nubians, Saladin sent a gift to his former commander and teacher, the Zengid leader Nur ad-Din, giving him 60,000 dinars, jewels, and an elephant. Whilst travelling with these riches to Nur ad-Din's palace in Damascus, Saladin attacked Crusader positions in the countryside, burning crops and homesteads in order to inflict economic damage. Although he refrained from attacking castles, he also harboured a wish to drive out the Muslim Bedouins, who acted as guides and aides for the European Crusaders, and therefore aimed his attack at the civilian population of this region of the Levant. On the 9th of August 1173, Saladin was saddened when news arrived that his father, Ayyub, had died following a horse-riding accident. For many years, Saladin had received the benefit of his father's good advice, and so when he died, Saladin was well equipped to make the best of the many opportunities which would present themselves to him over the coming years. In 1174, Saladin used his position of power to order his brother Turan Shah to attack Yemen, and he successfully acquired the port of Aden, becoming a significant political leader in the Fatimid Caliphate, and expanding their territories in the process. And later, in 1174, Saladin proclaimed himself Sultan of Egypt, starting his family's reign in the country, which would become known as the Ayyubid Sultanate or dynasty. However, following this, tensions began rising between Saladin and his former master, Nur ad-Din, who was greatly concerned by his former servant's rise to power. He formed a plan to attack him in Egypt in order to claim the region for himself. But word reached Saladin of the preparations, and he began gathering his forces outside of Cairo. Before any conflict ensued, Nur ad-Din died in Damascus on the 15th of May 1174 at the age of 56, and he was succeeded by his 11-year-old son, As-Salih Ismail al-Malik, weakening the Zengid dynasty's rule over Syria, as As-Salih was too young to govern his territories effectively, which caused infighting amongst the Syrian emirs or nobles, further weakening the country. The threat posed to Saladin's new dynasty was therefore mitigated, and the Zengid Caliphate descended into crisis, decentralizing power bases throughout their Syrian territory. Saladin initially attempted to gain favor with the young king by writing him an impassioned letter full of grief at the passing of his father, promising to, quote, act like a sword against his enemies, thus pledging to remain in the defense and service of the Zengid regime. Following the death of Nur ad-Din, Saladin faced a difficult dilemma. He had originally intended to maintain his campaign against the Crusaders, although knew that he would be more effectively placed to launch an invasion of Crusader-held land if he marched from Zengid territory in the north, in Syria, rather than from Egypt. If he waited for the new king As-Salih to call on his help, he could avoid any possible conflict which may have been caused by acting on his own to acquire Syria, a land which had previously been the territory of his former master, an act which would have been forbidden under Islamic principles. By August 1174, the boy king As-Salih had been placed under the guardianship of Gumushtigin, who had formerly been in a powerful position as the emir of Mosul, and had also been a close advisor to the former king Nur ad-Din. Gumushtigin had therefore assumed the effective position of regent of the Zengid kingdom, and used his new position to remove political rivals throughout Syria. This led to an escalation of existing internal conflicts, and further destabilized the Zengid regime. Saladin seized upon the infighting within Syria, and following a call for aid from the emir of Damascus, who was threatened by Gumushtigin, he entered Syria with 700 horsemen, passing through Al-Kerak and reaching the city of Bosra in modern-day southern Syria. Saladin would later write himself about the masses who joined his force, which included Bedouins, emirs, and soldiers from all over the region, all of whom feared the influence of Gumushtigin. By the 23rd of November, he had arrived in Damascus and rested at his father's old home, and the next day he marched to the gates of the citadel of Damascus and requested that he be given access, but the commander of the defense, Rayhan, refused. Saladin ordered his brother, Tugtakin ibn Ayyub, to besiege the citadel, and the guard capitulated 4 days later, allowing Saladin and his forces to enter through the heavy arched-shaped gates of the castle. He installed himself in the fortress and received congratulations and homage from the inhabitants of the city, who recognized his authority and influence. Once he had installed Ayyubid authority in Damascus, Saladin left his brother Tugtakin ibn Ayyub in command of the city and moved to take other areas, which had formerly been under the control of Nur ad-Din, but had since descended into arbitrary law after his death. He conquered the city of Hama without any significant difficulty, although he avoided attacking the city of Homs due to the fact that it played host to a powerful fortress, which he knew would be an arduous citadel to attack. He then laid siege to Aleppo on the 30th of December, where the boy king As-Salih was sheltering. The king realized the danger posed by Saladin and emerged from his palace to personally implore the people and guards of Aleppo not to capitulate to Saladin, who had proven himself an influential political leader, much loved by the populations he had thus far conquered. The Zengid emir of Mosul, Saif al-Din, then sent an army to relieve Aleppo and met Saladin's forces at the Battle of the Horns of Hama. Gumushtigin was in a state of fear following Saladin's latest aggressive actions, and made contact with Rashid ad-Din Sinan, the head of the assassins of Syria, asking him to kill Saladin whilst he rested in his camp. The assassins were an order founded in 1090 in the Ismaili doctrine of Shia Islam by Hassan-i-Sabah, a leader of the Nizari Ismaili Shia sect, whose followers were known as the Assassiyun. Their current leader, ad-Din Sinan, was opposed to Saladin as he had taken control of the Fatimid of Egypt under the command of Caliph al-Adid, which was against the will of his sect. The tactics employed by the Assassiyun were centered around secretive, targeted killings, ultimately becoming known in turn as assassinations. And so, on the 11th of May 1175, a band of 13 assassins gained access to Saladin's camp, although they were detected before they could carry out their attack by Nasir al-Din Humartekin, one of Saladin's officers. One of the assassins was killed by another of Saladin's generals, and the others were forced to flee when the attention of the camp was drawn to them, Saladin having narrowly escaped an untimely death. Soon after this incident, Saladin learned that Raymond of Tripoli had gathered his forces to the west at Nahar al-Kabir, a river which ran into the Mediterranean in modern-day Lebanon, and was strategically well placed for an attack. So Saladin decided to move his forces westward to the city of Homs, although he was soon forced to retreat back from Homs when he learned that the cousin of Gumushtigin, Saif al-Din, had sent a relief force to bolster the city against attack. Whilst Saladin was fighting in the western Levant, his enemies in Syria and Jazira were in the process of waging a propaganda war against him. His enemies stated that Saladin had engaged in a war against his former master's land, and hence had lost all semblance of religious and moral dignity. Saladin responded to this claim by disengaging near Homs, claiming that he was actually campaigning against the Crusaders, who had gathered to the west. His army returned to Hama to the north, and engaged with a Crusader force which had landed there. The Crusaders, upon hearing of Saladin's advance, ordered a preemptive retreat, a move which Saladin hailed as, quote, a victory opening the gates of men's hearts. And so, having salvaged his reputation with a bloodless attack on Hama, Saladin returned to Homs and attacked it, conquering the city in March 1175 after a bloody fight with the defenders located in the formidable citadel. Saif al-Din was the head of the Zengids and was superior even to Gumushtigin as the regional power broker, and when he heard of Saladin's success, he grew fearful. Al-Din regarded Syria and Mesopotamia as his estate, and was therefore angered when he learned of the invasion of his territory by Saladin from his base in Egypt. And so, Saif al-Din summoned a large army with the intention of pushing Saladin out of his territory and dispatched it to Aleppo. The combined forces of Mosul and Aleppo gathered together against Saladin and marched on his northern position of Hama. Then Saladin, realizing that he was far outnumbered, attempted to broker an agreement with the Zengids, stating that he would call off all further incursions north into Syria, if an agreement could be reached, although this was not enough for Saif al-Din, who demanded that Saladin withdraw with all his forces back to Egypt. Saladin in turn refused and prepared for a confrontation, realizing that no other avenue was open to him, and so he took up a defensive position on the horns of Hama, a series of hills located near the Orontes River, a dusty and rugged landscape. And on the 13th of April 1175, the coalition forces of the Zengids arrived to attack Saladin, although they soon found that they had been surrounded by Saladin's forces and were severely damaged by his attack. During the battle, which became known as the Battle of the Horns of Hama, Zengid forces managed to break through the left flank of Saladin's army, but were then engaged by the elite troops who made up Saladin's personal guard, and Saladin was soon being bolstered by a significant contingent of reinforcements who had arrived from his base in Egypt. The battle was largely bloodless, although resulted in a significant victory for Saladin, who pursued his enemies far to the north until they reached the gates of Aleppo itself. The boy king, al-Malik, was subsequently forced to recognize Saladin as the ruler of several key provinces in Damascus, Homs and Hama, as well as in a number of towns which lay to the south of Aleppo, which had been captured in the pursuit northwards of Saif al-Din's Zengid force after the Battle of the Horns of Hama. After this victory, Saladin proclaimed that he was king and suppressed the name and hence influence of al-Malik in prayers, popular culture, and coinage. Indeed, Saladin formed his own coinage and ordered the development of prayers in his own style, as was his jurisdiction as king. As well as this, the Syrian-based Abbasid Caliphate recognized Saladin as one of their allies, and soon proclaimed that he was formally considered by them to be the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. The Battle of the Horns of Hama did not end the contest for power between Saladin's Ayyub kingdom and the Zengids, which was eventually settled in their final confrontation in the spring of 1176 at the Battle of Tel Sultan. Troops from Egypt were used by Saladin to significantly reinforce his army, and his opponent, Saif al-Din, recruited his forces from areas such as Al-Jazira. Saladin advanced northward and crossed the Orontes River, although during this first advance the sun was eclipsed and the event was taken as an ill omen of the campaign. He pressed northward nonetheless and reached the outskirts of Aleppo, reaching a site located just south of the city, known as the Sultan's Mound, now the town of Tel Sultan. Saladin's forces met those of Saif al-Din at the Sultan's Mound, and the subsequent hand-to-hand combat was brutal. The left flank of Saladin's force was driven back and crossed in front of their commander as the Zengids advanced, which meant that Saladin himself was then forced to charge at the Zengids' guard, causing them to panic and lose their forward momentum. Saif al-Din narrowly escaped capture with this sudden change of events, and many of his officers were taken prisoner. When they found that their army had entered into a hasty retreat, the Ayyubids managed to seize vast quantities of booty from the Zengids, including horses, armor, and jewels, although these were not kept, but were redistributed amongst the captured Zengid soldiers, who were then freed. Saladin is said to have kept none of the booty for himself, and with this victory under his belt, he continued his advance to the north, and reached the gates of the city of Aleppo. On arrival, he found the gates still closed, and so Saladin continued to attack cities located nearby, such as those of Manbij and Azaz. A few days later, Saladin was resting inside a tent owned by one of his captains, and was attacked by an assassin who stabbed at his head with a knife. Luckily, Saladin was still in his armor, and so the blade was unable to penetrate it. He grabbed the hand of the assailant and managed to wrestle him to the ground, shortly after which the attacker was killed. The failed attack made it clear to Saladin that his life was in perpetual danger from Saif al-Din and his friends in the Syrian assassins, and so he decided to increase his stranglehold on Aleppo, intending to capture the city as soon as possible. The city of Azaz capitulated on the 21st of June, leaving Saladin with an undivided army, which he aimed at Aleppo. The city was once again besieged, although it did not yield to Saladin's ferocious attacks, and after a number of days, both sides managed to come to a mutually convenient arrangement. Saif al-Din pledged to recognize Saladin as the ruler over the territories which he had gained, and in return, Saladin pledged that al-Din would remain in command of Aleppo. This was a significant agreement and allowed Saladin to be recognized throughout the region as the King of Syria. And when the treaty was concluded, the younger sister of the boy king, al-Malik, came to Saladin and requested that the town of Azaz be returned to his control, and Saladin agreed. By mid-1176, Saladin had managed to secure peace treaties between himself, the Zengids, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But, despite these alliances, he was still under threat from the assassins, who, under the command of Rashid ad-Din Sinan, remained opposed to his rule in both Egypt and Syria. The assassins remained a powerful regional force who held command of 9 castles. They were based in the An-Nusayriya mountain range, located in the west, inland of the Syrian coastline, and their tactics in battle and ability to perform targeted killings were renowned. And it was this which later led to the term assassination, and the concept of the assassin as a vocation, rather than a geopolitical affiliation. Saladin intended to destroy the assassins and their influence in the region, and moved his army into the Syrian coastal mountains in August 1176. He was forced to retreat the same month, after he failed to capture any of the fortresses held by the assassins, managing only to mount a scorched earth campaign against the region. The sudden withdrawal has been the subject of much scrutiny, with some claiming that another assassination attempt on Saladin ultimately led to the withdrawal, although this is highly contested. It is more likely that Saladin, unable to capture any significant territory, wished to redirect his attention to other theatres, namely against the Crusader forces. Saladin knew that the assassins could prove powerful allies to Christian forces in the region, and wished to recruit them first. Moreover, the Crusaders posed a common enemy for Saladin as well as Rashid ad-Din Sinan, and provided the basis of an alliance between the two, later demonstrated when Sinan sent forces to bolster Saladin's armies. The war with the assassins was over, and the two forces fostered their cooperative relationship, the peace mediated to a great extent by Saladin's uncle, the Emir of Hama, and so Saladin then returned to Cairo in the late summer of 1177, after being absent for 2 years, and set about rebuilding the city's defences, and seeing to the various affairs of state which had been neglected in his absence, including the construction of a large bridge at Giza, a few miles outside of Cairo. The old king of Jerusalem, Amalric I, had died of dysentery in 1174, which meant that his young son, Baldwin IV, was now king of Jerusalem. The young king was only 13 at the time, so his uncle, Raymond III of Tripoli, ruled in his stead until Baldwin was of age, and the following year Raymond signed a peace treaty with Saladin. Baldwin ascended to the throne 2 years after his father's death, but was not expected to reign for long, as he was a leper. The disease of leprosy was a bacterial infection which was spread from person to person by the ingestion of bodily fluids. These bacteria, or Mycobacterium lepori, would produce no initial symptoms, but would eventually lead to the victim suffering from inflammation of the nerve endings and body tissues, often resulting in the loss of feeling or the ability to feel pain. The result was that the infected person would not notice wounds or infections, leading to the loss of limbs, as well as recurring serious infections. Baldwin, the young king, did not allow the infection to deter him from his duty as monarch, however, and sought throughout his reign to rule his kingdom as best he could. And in late 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem moved many of its Christian forces north to besiege a fortress located above Aleppo at Harim, which meant that Christian territory, located in southern Palestine, was left with few defenders. Saladin knew that this was an opportunity not to be missed, and marched to the city of Ascalon, now located in southern Israel, breaking the peace treaty he had made with Baldwin's uncle Raymond III of Tripoli. His 26,000-strong force then dispersed into the surrounding areas, raiding and sacking local settlements as far east as Jerusalem itself. King Baldwin then rode to the aid of Ascalon, and Saladin allowed him to enter the city along with 375 knights, and thinking that he had King Baldwin contained, he left part of his force to hold the Crusaders at the city, whilst he marched towards Jerusalem himself. However, Saladin's containing force proved to be too weak, as Baldwin's small force also contained some highly skilled generals, and Baldwin broke out of Ascalon and pursued Saladin before catching up with him on the 25th of November, 1177, near Ramla, taking the Sultan by surprise. Being unprepared for the attack, the Crusaders quickly destroyed the Muslim army, and Saladin resorted to fleeing the Battle of Montgisard on the back of a camel heading for Egypt. His forces were pursued for 12 miles after the battle, and Saladin reached Cairo by the 8th of December, with only 1/10 of his army remaining. This defeat did not deter Saladin from further combat operations against the Crusaders, and the conflict continued over the coming months, Saladin claiming revenge for Montgisard by defeating Baldwin in various other engagements during the spring of 1178, when he led skirmishes against the Crusaders from his base at Homs, such as at Hama, and from each encounter he brought back many treasures and riches as a consequence of the capture of prisoners and spoils of war at the various engagements. Following the defeat of Baldwin at Hama, Saladin then ordered that all Crusaders who had been captured were to be put to death through beheading. He spent the rest of the year in Syria without any further engagements with his enemies. However, the following year, intelligence reached Saladin that the Crusaders were planning an offensive into Syria, and he therefore ordered one of his generals, Farrukh Shah, to advance with an army of 1,000 men to the Damascus frontier to defend the territory from attack. The plan was that, instead of engaging the enemy, Farrukh Shah's force would warn the Damascene of the impending attack by lighting fires, following which Saladin would advance from the city with an army. In April of 1179, Baldwin and his band of knights attacked Muslim herders and civilians in the Golan Heights, expecting no resistance. Baldwin then advanced quickly on Farrukh Shah and his forces, although he did so without expecting the volume of Ayyubid troops who met him, and was subsequently defeated once again at Quenitra after this victory. Saladin was enthused and requested reinforcements from Egypt, which gained him another 1,500 horsemen. The summer of 1179 saw Baldwin engaged in establishing an outpost on the road to Damascus, which ran north from his position to the city. He aimed to fortify a passage on the road, which spanned the River Jordan, known locally as Jacob's Ford. Saladin offered Baldwin IV 100,000 gold pieces to abandon the project, but he declined. And so, his attempt at diplomacy having failed, Saladin sought to destroy the Crusaders' position at their castle of Chastele, a Templar fortress. In preparation for the attack, Saladin moved his headquarters to the Banias Plain, which ran through the Golan Heights and located the position south of the fortress. The Crusaders saw this as an opportunity for attack and charged south toward the Ayyubid position, although they were rash in their advance and soon had their cavalry and infantry divisions separated. This gave Saladin the perfect opportunity for a counterattack, and he charged towards the disorganized band of crusaders with his army, dealing the crusader force a heavy defeat and leaving it in ruin. Many significant knights were captured during the fray, and booty was taken in abundance. Saladin then advanced forward and besieged the castle, which fell on the 30th of August, 1179. In the spring of 1180, Saladin travelled to Safad, a city located to the west of the Golan Heights, towards the Mediterranean. He intended to launch a full-scale campaign against the Kingdom of Jerusalem, although this was evidently a source of concern for Baldwin, who sent Saladin a message imploring that he negotiate a peace. Droughts and bad harvests had damaged the fighting ability of Saladin's army, and so he agreed to Baldwin's request to cease hostilities. Raymond of Tripoli denounced the truce and was angered with the capitulation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, although he was soon forced to accept the terms of the agreement when he was raided by the Ayyubids, and Saladin's navy arrived off the port of Tartus, where Raymond was located. Saladin used the lull in the fighting with the Crusaders to further consolidate his power, and attempted to gain control over Mosul from the remaining Zengids, but his attempt eventually failed, and the Zengid dynasty would remain in power in the region until the Mongols overran it in 1250. Saladin did, however, secure the capture of Aleppo, making his control over Syria complete. In 1183, King Baldwin had his nephew, who was also named Baldwin, crowned as joint monarch of Jerusalem. The boy was the son of King Baldwin's sister Sibylla of Jerusalem, whose first husband, William of Montferrat, had died in 1177, after which, in 1180, Sibylla fell in love and married Guy de Lusignan, an ambitious French knight, with whom she had become infatuated. Baldwin distrusted both his sister and de Lusignan, and greatly feared for the future of the succession, trying to have their marriage annulled. They remained together, however, and their marriage and rise to power would prove to have disastrous consequences for both of them and the Kingdom of Jerusalem as a whole. King Baldwin finally succumbed to his leprosy and died on the 16th of March 1185, aged just 24, making his nephew, Baldwin V, King of Jerusalem. But the kingdom was once again placed under the regency of the ever-present Raymond of Tripoli. The boy king was poorly himself and died a little after a year after his predecessor, leaving his mother Sibylla as next in line. And so, on the boy's death, Guy de Lusignan then ascended the throne. Over the coming years, both the Crusader armies and Saladin's forces faced off against each other, both waiting for the other to make a mistake. And then, in 1187, one of Guy de Lusignan's followers, a knight named Reynald of Châtillon, raided a Muslim caravan, despite a truce being in place between the Crusaders and Saladin, and some accounts claim that the Sultan's own sister was raped during the raid, prompting Saladin to swear he would kill Châtillon. The Sultan then sent his son with a small army to raid the area around Acre, resulting in him winning a notable victory at the Battle of Cresson. Saladin then laid siege to the city of Tiberias, which provoked the more bloodthirsty members of Guy de Lusignan's entourage to advise the king to engage Saladin in open battle. And despite the fact that his own wife was trapped in Tiberias, Raymond of Tripoli advised de Lusignan not to engage the Muslims. But Guy ignored him and assembled the combined Crusader forces, numbering in the region of 20,000 troops, including 1,200 knights. Saladin had also assembled a massive force of around 30,000 troops and cavalry, and had hoped to provoke a response from the Crusaders with his incursions into their territory. And after holding a war council, the Crusaders did make the decision to leave their supply base at La Safarie and attack Saladin at Tiberias. Along the way, the Crusaders were continually harassed by Muslim archers, and Saladin's forces placed themselves between the Crusaders and local water supplies, meaning that after a matter of days, the army lay despondent, dying of thirst, while Saladin's forces were themselves supplied with water by regular caravans from Lake Tiberias. Then, on the 4th of July, 1187, under the cover of a smokescreen caused by the Muslim army burning dry grass around the Crusaders, Saladin amassed his forces into formation, and what followed was not a battle, but was rather a rout and slaughter, as by this time the Crusader army had been driven half mad with thirst, and were exhausted by the long hot marching, as well as demoralized by the fires and smoke and constant skirmishing. Instead of forming a battle line and concentrating on attacking the Muslims, the Crusader army was more concerned with reaching Lake Tiberias to take on water. This resulted in the complete collapse of the army as an organized force, and many fled the field when they could, and the remainder were forced to either beg the Muslims for death or put up whatever meager defense they could, with the little remaining energy they could still muster. Then, after a series of increasingly desperate charges, the Crusaders were forced back, and Guy de Lusignan himself was captured. And so, the Battle of Hattin was an apocalyptic disaster for the Christians, with as few as 3,000 nobles, knights and troops surviving the confrontation, and the survivors forced to leave the corpses of their comrades to rot and fester in the sun, covered by egg-laying flies, maggots and carrion birds. After the battle, Guy de Lusignan and Reynald of Castillon, along with other high-ranking nobles, were brought to Saladin's tent. The Sultan offered Guy a drink, which was a sign that he was to be spared. But instead of accepting the gracious gesture, Guy handed the drink to Reynald. Saladin then struck it from Castillon's hand, stating that he did not offer the drink to him. What happened next differs from account to account. Some say Saladin decapitated Reynald with a single sword stroke, whilst others say he struck Reynald, which was a sign for his guards to execute him immediately. Whatever the truth, both Reynald and all the high-ranking nobles in the Crusader army were beheaded, along with the captured Knights Templar and Hospitaller. Guy assumed he would be next, but the Sultan spared him, stating that kings do not kill kings. He was then taken as a prisoner to Damascus, but was released by Saladin in 1187. The Sultan's forces then took each Crusader stronghold in turn. As there was no army left strong enough to oppose them, his aim was to take Jerusalem itself without conflict, as a prolonged battle for the city would risk the lives of Muslims living within its walls, and also risk the destruction of Muslim holy places. The defenders, led by Queen Sibylla and Balian of Ibelin, knew this, but also knew that they would be slaughtered or enslaved if the city was taken by force, so eventually terms were agreed for the occupants of Jerusalem to leave the city unmolested, in return for a small ransom per head to be paid to the Sultan. But enough money was raised to pay for the freedom of only around 18,000 of the city's 30,000 inhabitants, and the remainder were taken into slavery, whilst the lucky few made their way to the coastal city of Tyre, which was the last stronghold held by the Christians in the Holy Land. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves throughout Europe, and it is even said that Pope Urban III collapsed and died upon hearing the news of the defeat. The new Pope, Gregory VIII, stated that the capture of Jerusalem was punishment for the sins of Christianity, and a call to arms went out across the continent. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, after whom Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was named, then raised an army and advanced through Anatolia towards the Holy Land, but whilst crossing a river, his horse slipped and the elderly king drowned. The new King of England, Richard I, then sought to raise an army himself, taking the cross and joining the Crusades, and so he joined King Philip II of France. Meanwhile, Guy de Lusignan, who had been released by Saladin, returned to Tyre and mustered an army with which he laid siege to the city of Acre. But for 2 long years, neither side were able to bring about a decisive defeat on the other. Then, in June 1191, Richard I's 17,000-strong army arrived at Acre, replenishing the Crusader forces and consolidating their stranglehold over the city. Richard had brought with him prefabricated siege engines which were now deployed against the walls, but Saladin countered this by using Greek fire, a type of ancient flamethrower, setting them ablaze and reducing them to ashes. Richard then offered gold to his men for every stone they could remove from the base of one of the city's towers. Soon the tower collapsed, and the Crusaders charged through the gap, finally capturing the city in July 1191, whilst taking nearly 3,000 prisoners. Richard then attempted to negotiate the prisoners' release in exchange for money, as well as the return of the True Cross, which had been captured by the Muslims at the Battle of Hattin. Saladin began to arrange payment for them, but after certain nobles were not released, Richard ordered the execution of all the Muslim prisoners, prompting Saladin to execute his own Christian prisoners. Richard knew that he would be unable to capture Jerusalem without taking the port of Jaffa to the south, and so in August 1191 he set out with his army along the coast, so that he could be easily supplied from the sea. Richard also knew that his army depended on regular supplies of water, and rested his troops at water sources, and also commanded his army to halt during the heat of the day. Saladin closely shadowed the Crusaders, all the time harassing their rear guard, until on the 7th of December 1191 he attacked Richard's army. The Muslim forces effectively surrounded the Crusaders and began to pepper them with arrows in order to provoke a response in the shape of a charge. Richard knew what Saladin was trying to do, and gave strict orders for his troops not to break formation. Then the Knights Hospitaller broke ranks and flung themselves at the Muslim forces. Saladin committed more troops to the fight, but Richard had kept his heavy cavalry in reserve, and then used them to flank the Muslims, causing their army to rout. Richard had secured another famous victory over Saladin at the Battle of Arsuf, and he then occupied Jaffa and rebuilt the defences around the city, after which he advanced towards Jerusalem. However, they were unable to take the city, as divisions arose between the army's leaders about whether they should attack Egypt and force Saladin to surrender Jerusalem, or instead take the city by force directly. This, combined with extended supply lines, forced the Crusaders to withdraw from within sight of Jerusalem, and they would never again have a greater opportunity to capture the holy city. Saladin then attacked Jaffa itself, but was again defeated by the Crusaders, which forced both sides to realize that neither could defeat the other conclusively, and peace negotiations started, resulting in the Treaty of Jaffa, in which both sides agreed a truce for 3 years, and Christians were also allowed to travel to Jerusalem as unarmed pilgrims. Richard then left the Holy Land shortly afterwards, in October 1192, and returned home, ending the Third Crusade. Although he had not won the war decisively, as Saladin kept the vast majority of his gains over the Christians, and most importantly, held Jerusalem. But the Sultan was not destined to live for much longer, and less than 6 months after Richard's departure, Saladin fell ill with a fever and died in Damascus on the 4th of March 1193. He had given away the majority of his wealth to his poorer subjects, and there was not enough left to pay for his funeral, but he was eventually laid to rest in a mausoleum in Damascus, in the Umayyad Mosque, which is named after his dynasty, and Saladin's tomb can still be seen in Damascus to this very day. Within a few decades, Saladin rose from total obscurity to become the most powerful leader in the Muslim world, and arguably the most powerful man in the world, until the rise of Genghis Khan. And without him, the Crusaders may well have gained greater control over the Holy Land. It is also fair to assume that without the unification of Egypt and Syria, it is doubtful there would have been a regional power strong enough to withstand the Mongol invasion in the following decades. Saladin's personal standard, the so-called Saladin's Eagle, can still be seen on the state flag of Egypt, and is incorporated into the national coats of arms of Iraq, Somaliland, and Yemen, demonstrating the prominence of his legacy within Middle Eastern political culture. However, Saladin was not necessarily the saint-like figure he is sometimes portrayed to be. It must be remembered that during the Crusades, both sides committed atrocities and massacres, but no one can deny Saladin's brilliance as a military commander and leader, and his effectiveness as a ruler. He, along with the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, were responsible for the eventual defeat of the Crusaders, and he stands today as a colossus of the medieval Middle East. He is rightly revered and respected throughout the Christian and Muslim world by many, and is considered a legendary figure to this very day. What do you think of Saladin? Was he merely fortunate to capitalize on the weakness of the Crusader states in retaking Jerusalem? Or was he one of the Islamic world's greatest leaders who united Islam against the Christian invaders and reclaimed the holy city for the children of the Prophet? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.